Hello everybody. If you want to read all the story's content in full, please go to www.steveuk.blog. Thank you. Short story 681A. Home Office wasted billions. Intermediate. Once upon a time in the United Kingdom, the government department known as the Home Office found itself in charge of providing accommodation for people seeking asylum. At first, the job was simple: find a safe place for someone to stay while their claim was processed. But over time, the task became much more complex. Rising numbers of arrivals meant more people needed places to live. In response, the Home Office began using large numbers of hotels to house asylum seekers on short-notice contracts. At first, the cost of this hotel accommodation appeared manageable, but soon the figures rose sharply. For example, in the financial year 2022-23, the Home Office spent about £2.28 billion on hotel accommodation. House of Lords Library. In 2023-24, the total cost of asylum support was about £4.7 billion, of which around £3 billion was spent just on hotels. Why did the cost go so high? Several reasons. Hotels are much more expensive than other kinds of accommodation. According to one report, the average cost per night for hotel-based asylum accommodation in 2024-25 was around £170 per person, compared with about £27 per night for other types of accommodation. The contracts were hurried and large in scale, and the Home Office was criticised for lacking strong commercial expertise. The scale of the contracts was underestimated. A deal that was originally planned to cost about £4.5 billion over a decade is now expected to cost about £15.3 billion. As the spending soared, many people began to say that the Home Office was squandering taxpayers' money because millions were being spent on accommodation that was intended to be temporary but often lasted for many months. There was little evidence that the system was organised to obtain best value for money or to use resources efficiently. Because the accommodation was so expensive, fewer funds were left for other support services which might have helped asylum seekers integrate or move into more stable living conditions. In schools of thought among auditors and think tanks, this pattern came to symbolise waste. Public money going into expensive hotel contracts, big overheads and poor value, instead of lower cost and more stable solutions. However, the story does not end in despair. The Home Office and its ministers acknowledged the problem. Plans were announced to end the use of hotels for asylum accommodation by 2029 and reduce the huge costs involved. In the final chapter, the government shifts focus. It begins investing in more permanent and cost-effective housing, spreads people into communities rather than clustering them in hotels, and works to reduce the backlog of asylum applications so that fewer people wait long periods in expensive accommodation. Thus, what began as a case of misspending and growing bills becomes a turning point. The Home Office realises that wasting billions cannot continue. A new path is chosen, one that promises better value, better conditions for asylum seekers, and better outcomes for taxpayers. And so the story closes. A system once riddled with waste takes the first steps towards reform. And while the bill remains large, the hope is that future spending will be wiser, fairer, and more efficient. Vocabulary notes. Accommodation. Meaning, a place where someone lives or stays, especially temporarily. From the story, the Home Office began using large numbers of hotels to house asylum seekers on short-notice accommodation contracts. Explanation. In this context, accommodation refers to places like hotels, hostels, or housing provided for people who do not have a home yet. Similar words, phrases: housing, lodging, temporary shelter, living arrangements. Squander, squandering, meaning to waste money, time, or resources in a careless or foolish way. From the story, many people began to say that the Home Office was squandering taxpayers' money. Explanation: the word shows strong criticism. It suggests that the money was not just spent, but spent badly, without good planning or benefit. Similar words: waste, misuse, throw away, fritter away. Value for money, meaning getting good value or results for the amount of money spent. From the story, there was little evidence that the system was organized to obtain best value for money. Explanation: when something doesn't give value for money, it means you are paying too much for what you get. Similar words, phrases: cost-effective, worthwhile, economical, a good deal. Backlog, meaning a large number of tasks or cases that are waiting to be processed. From the story, and works to reduce the backlog of asylum applications. Explanation: a backlog happens when work arrives faster than it can be completed. In this case, many asylum claims were waiting for decisions. Similar words: queue, pile up, waiting list, accumulation. Temporary, meaning for a short time, not permanent. From the story, accommodation that was intended to be temporary but often lasted for many months. Explanation: something temporary is meant to last only for a little while, but sometimes temporary situations last much longer than expected. Similar words: short-term, brief, provisional, makeshift. Story written by ChatGPT AI. Image created by ChatGPT AI. To read all the story's content in full, please go to www.steveuk.blog. Thank you. CC Music, drifting at 432 Hz, Unicorn Heads.
Welcome to this deep dive. We're looking today at the UK Home Office and its handling of asylum seeker accommodation.
Specifically the costs, right? How things got so expensive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's really a story about how aiming for temporary solutions kind of spiraled into, well, billions being spent, some might say wasted.
Mm-hmm. And when you dig into the sources, our job here is to pull out those key financial details, the numbers that really show what happened.
Yeah, find the story in the figures.
Yeah.
And the main shock figure, I think, has to be the total cost for asylum support in 2023-24. We're talking about $4.7 billion overall.
A huge sum. But the really staggering part is how much of that was just for hotels.
Right. So out of that $4.7 billion, how much are we looking at for just hotel rooms?
It's about $3 billion just on hotels. Not support, not processing claims, just the accommodation itself.
Wow. $3 billion.
Yeah.
That really paints a picture of an emergency measure becoming the default, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And the inefficiency is stark when you look at the nightly cost per person.
Okay, let's get into that. What was the difference between putting someone in one of these emergency hotels versus other types of accommodation?
Well, the average hotel spot costs around £170 per person per night.
170 pounds a night.
Yeah. Now compare that to other more planned non-hotel options. That cost is closer to £27 per night.
27. So what, 6 times cheaper? More.
Roughly, yes. You could essentially house 6 people in more stable, planned accommodation for the price of 1 person in a hotel for 1 night. It's quite a gap.
That difference really explains why this became such a huge issue, this idea of wasted money. And it points towards, well, problems with how those hotel deals were, doesn't it? The commercial side.
Definitely. The Home Office faced a lot of criticism for, let's say, a lack of commercial expertise when setting up these contracts under pressure.
And there was that one massive contract example that really ballooned.
Oh, yeah. The deal originally pitched at $4.5 billion over 10 years. The latest estimates put the potential cost at $15.3 billion.
$15.3 billion from 4.5. That's not just an overrun, that's something else entirely.
It signifies a major failure in contract management, likely driven by urgency and maybe a lack of competition. They were paying premium short notice rates for a very long time.
And this is where the term squandering or poor value for money comes in. It wasn't just the high price tag itself, it was what that money wasn't being used for.
Precisely. When so much cash is tied up in just paying for hotel rooms and the associated management overheads from private firms, it's not going into, say, faster processing of asylum claims.
Or into support services that might actually help people integrate or move on once their claim is decided.
Exactly. The temporary accommodation often stretched for many, many months because of the backlog. So huge sums were spent just maintaining people in limbo, essentially.
Okay, so that's the scale of the problem, a huge inefficient spend. But things have started to shift, haven't they? There's been an acknowledgement of this.
Yes, that's the positive turn, I suppose. The Home Office and ministers publicly conceded that the spending, particularly on hotels, was unsustainable. They had to.
And there's now an official plan to move away from this model.
Correct. The government has announced a plan to stop using hotels for asylum accommodation entirely by 2029. The main driver is obviously to slash that huge £3 billion annual hotel bill.
By 2029. That sounds ambitious. What does the new approach actually involve on the ground?
Well, it's a few things. Investing in more permanent, cheaper housing options is key.
Right, like the 27.7 a night places.
Hopefully, yes. Also, dispersing people more widely into communities rather than concentrating them in hotels, and crucially, tackling the asylum application backlog.
The backlog. Because if people get decisions faster,
they spend less time needing accommodation, especially expensive temporary kinds. Reducing that waiting time is probably the single biggest factor in making the whole system more efficient and less costly.
But setting up permanent housing, dispersing people, clearing the backlog, that's a massive undertaking to achieve by 2029.
Oh, it's a huge logistical challenge. It needs coordination, investment, and cooperation with local councils, which, hasn't always been straightforward.
So if we're summing this up for you, the listener, what's the core story here?
I think it's a system that reacted to rising numbers with very expensive short-term fixes, the hotels, which then became embedded and incredibly costly.
Yeah, and now there's a forced shift, really, towards trying to build a more sustainable, efficient, long-term system.
Yeah.
A move from crisis spending to planned investment.
Exactly. The transition away from that £170 a night emergency footing is officially underway. The new strategy promises better value, better outcomes, hopefully.
It was always a but, isn't there? Well, the plan is there. The challenge is huge.
Right. The massive bill has already been run up. The big question now is how quickly can they actually implement these reforms, build the housing, clear the backlog before 2029?
And will future spending truly be wiser? Or will they still be paying off the costs of these past decisions as that deadline approaches? That seems like the key thing to watch.
Definitely. It's a race against time and budget, really.